do another reaction here to I forget his name, uh, Delamar, something like that. Let me see. Let me get my face out of the way.
Existed.
Durante Lamar. So we're doing another reaction here. Once again, I don't know too much about his belief system, if he's strictly atheistic. But we're just gonna kind of go because I watched a little bit of this video. I was about 5 minutes in, and from what I could tell, I had absolutely nothing. I mean, he's spot on, and there was just a couple of things that I wanted to add. Now, I do understand that I can only add so much. I mean, this guy used to be a pastor, so. But there are a couple of things, kind of going into my experience of life because I grew up independent Baptist is what they always called it, and a lot of the things that he mentions in this video is like absolutely echoing my childhood, absolutely echoing my father figure, and I want to kind of like, because sometimes it can kind of be difficult for, not all homes are different. I mean, not all homes are the same. Not all Christian families operate the same. And so, talking about my experience in Christianity kind of helps bring a little bit of light to kind of everything that can, go on inside of a Christian household, right? And so, um, like I said, I did watch a little bit of this. I was about 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, and I was just like, you know what? I enjoy making these videos. I really do because it's it's one of those things. Christianity is just it's such a it's such a damning religion in a way, like it. Well, I'm not going to say too much about it, but I mean, almost everything that he mentions in this video is now I haven't seen the entire thing, but from the point that I've seen up to, is like childhood, 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 and so a lot of people just don't have that experience because they either had a more healthy childhood and all that kind of stuff. So let me just kind of break down who my dad was in the entire experience. So my dad was old. Okay, a lot of people may not know this about me. My dad is 82 years old, so he's old enough to be people's. Actually, he is, for people who are like 18 years old. He's their great grandfather. Okay, and I'm only 29, so my dad had me insanely late, and I think probably the biggest problem was that after he had me, about 8 to 10 years after he had me, they were considering having another child. Yeah, Jesus, it's bad. So, anyways, they haven't recovered. They're still not doing well, but and it's kind of funny because one of the reasons why they're not doing well is because they're kind of bypassing spiritual bypassing, right? It's a term that's used a lot in different kind of belief systems, but it's a term that's not used enough in Christianity. And it's the idea that instead of actually looking at yourself and looking at taking responsibility for the things that you've done and for the situations you've ended up in, it's putting it off on somebody else. It's the devil is why I'm broke. Instead of, I opened up a ton of credit cards and ran up a shit ton of credit card debt, and now I can't pay my credit card debt because I've overspent, and now I can't afford to do stuff. Jesus, please help me get me out of this situation. Like, that's spiritual bypassing, right? You're trying to blame everything that's going on in your life on some outside deity, right? So, anyways, let's get into this. And yeah, I saw this video, and although I know that this is kind of aimed as an atheistic, I have no idea if he's. Some people are strict atheists, some people are atheist agnostic, and stuff like that. I would say one of the problems with the atheistic community in general is that they tend to strictly follow scientists. They tend to follow scientific rigor, And the problem with scientific rigor is that, I went to college for a biomedical science degree, minor in chemistry, with the idea of going into a PhD in biochemistry and things like that. And so I'm very aware of how things in the scientific academia work. And in general, with these taboo topics, what you tend to find is not that professors don't have an interest in researching them, but you tend to find that doing any sort of research on a taboo topic will most certainly kill all of your credibility, and you could end up losing tenure over it. You could end up basically doing a career suicide just by deciding that you want to publish a research paper on your ghosts or something like that, right? And so it makes the situation where scientists can't go into taboo topics that we tend to hover around, and so it further creates that dichotomy of there is the spiritual world, but in the American lens, it's only Christianity, right? Even though that's a gross, that's a gross generalization of it. But and then on the other flip side of things, the atheistic world of there's only the physical world and nothing outside of it. And so you get a lot of these you know dichotomies that tend to show up, right? So um, basically, kind of talking about the scientific research process. I know plenty of professors that I have had kind of closed doors in their conversations inside of their office about taboo topics, and they basically always tell me the same thing. It's not a matter that they're not interested. It's not even a matter that they themselves had not had experiences with some of these more taboo things, but it's simply that public publishing of any sort of data, any sort of research paper, would automatically kill their credibility, and it would have long term consequences to their career. There is a let's see here. Where is it? Oh, where is this guy's research? If you guys don't know, there's a YouTube channel called Area 52, and I absolutely love this channel because um, he goes into all the taboo things, and he brings on congressmen, he brings on CIA agents, he brings on former intelligence agents, he brings on everybody. I mean, he's had congressmen, he's had all sorts of political figures on it. And they really are doing a lot of work to kind of raise awareness to the more taboo things that tend to happen on this planet that the scientific community as a whole refuses to look at, not out of curiosity, but simply out of looking at it, or even publishing anything on that would certainly mean basically the death of a career for them. And so you have to realize a PhD is almost like a 15-year commitment in some cases. And so, killing that is just an absolute death sentence for a lot of people, which is why they just don't do it. One of my professors in chemistry, what she used to do is she was Chinese. And whenever anybody, it was her taboo thing. The way that she used to study drugs, on treating drugs, is that she would first attack a problem, whatever the problem was. Maybe it was a problem that was brought to her, or maybe it was just a problem she was curious about. But then she would actually go into old ancient Chinese medicine and the old medicine, kind of shamans or whatever that existed in ancient China. And she used to recreate their recipes in her laboratory and study the different chemicals that would study the different chemicals and see how those chemicals, and extract the different chemicals, to see how those chemicals would react with the human body. And so basically she worked to isolate what from these taboo soups and teas and things like that were used to treat different medical issues in China, what chemical was responsible for providing that healing property? In which case, if you found a chemical that could provide the healing property, you could artificially synthesize that chemical and then use it for treatment, right? And so she had papers and papers and papers on all sorts of different drugs that she had synthesized for the treatment of various conditions. And whenever I would ask her about it, she said she would always tell me, and it was always kind of a hush hush conversation. She would always tell me, she said, John, people have already found the cure to all these diseases thousands of years ago. It's only our job to rediscover them. And I was like, right? Because at the time I was trying to study biochemistry. So, getting into this, I'll shut up and let's just kind of let this man speak.
A crime that makes no sense, and a punishment that never.
That's not the beginning. Oh, come on.
Most people think Christianity starts with Jesus. It doesn't. It starts with a story about a world that never existed, a crime that makes no sense, and a punishment that never. Sin doesn't make any sense without Genesis. Gender hierarchy doesn't exist without Genesis. Divine violence doesn't get justified without Genesis. Chosen people theology doesn't work without Genesis. Obedience over ethics doesn't survive without Genesis. Genesis isn't just the beginning of the Bible, it's the load-bearing wall. And today we're going to talk about what happens when that wall cracks. The opening chapter of Genesis does not describe a symbolic universe floating above history. It describes a very specific ancient cosmology that never existed. The world it presents is flat, covered by a solid dome called the firmament, with waters stored above the sky and beneath the earth. Light exists before stars, vegetation grows before the sun, and celestial bodies are reduced to functional lamps rather than massive cosmic structures. These are not.
I do have to say, I love the way that he talks so efficiently. Like, he doesn't say many words, but every word is packed with data. I love that. The scientist in me just loves that. It's like a very efficient form of listening.
Poetic abstractions. They reflect the pre scientific Near Eastern understanding of the world. The problem isn't simply that this picture is outdated, it's that the text presents this cosmology as divinely altered reality, not as myth, metaphor, or cultural storytelling. What makes this especially consequential is how the text is treated once it collides with modern knowledge. Genesis is read literally until observation contradicts it, at which point it is retroactively reclassified as metaphor. That move is not neutral. It trains readers to preserve authority at all cost. Sociologically, this creates a hierarchy of truth where sacred claims are insulated from falsification, while empirical evidence is treated as optional or suspect. The text becomes unfalsifiable by design, which is the opposite of how knowledge progresses in healthy societies. When authority is protected from correction, institutions built on that authority inherit the same immunity. Psychologically, this dynamic conditions people to distrust their own perception. When individuals are taught that what they can observe.
So breaking that down into simpler terms, what he's simply talking about how because he's using very intellectual language, and so I'm going to try to slow it down and make it a little easier to digest. Basically, the gist of what he's saying is that everything in the Bible is taught to be absolute fact and authority because it is divine inspiration, revelation, whatever you want to call it. It is God on a book. Is how it's portrayed. And so when you have these very obvious fallacies, these absolute fallacies that cannot exist, what Christians tend to do is create all of these excuses for why that specific thing may not be exactly how it's supposed to be, but the totality of everything is still sacred, right? And so that's basically the gist of what he's saying. It's when people bring up issues, when people bring up inconsistencies, when people bring up contradictions, which there's hundreds of contradictions inside of the Bible, I want to say there's a guy called John of New. He has a channel, John of New, or the Recovering Catholic. He's got a couple channels. One of those channels, he pulls out all the contradictions in the Bible. And it's literally just like a 15-minute video where he is rapid firing because there's so many contradictions. He is just rapid firing through all the contradictions in the Bible, every single one of them. And it's just 15 minutes of him reading da 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 da, and it's like the most triggering video for so many Christians. But because they live in the premise that the Bible is absolute truth because it's divine, right? So I just wanted to make sure anybody who maybe isn't as intensely, because I know that there's also like a lot of new Christians and stuff like that kind of stumble onto these videos and they get really concerned about stuff. The reality is that and I see a bunch of people who like convert to Christianity and they're like completely rebuking their old ways, and I'm just like, wait till you learn enough. Don't worry, you can still walk out. So.
Test and verify must yield to what they are told is divinely true. They learn an early lesson in epistemic submission. Over time, this erodes intellectual confidence and replaces curiosity with compliance. The mind is not trained to ask, is this true? But who said this? And whether that source has sufficient authority to override reality. This is not just a theological posture. It becomes a transferable habit that affects politics, relationships, and personal decision making. At a societal level, Genesis' creation narrative helps normalize a worldview where explanation flows from power rather than evidence. If the universe itself is framed as something understood through revelation rather than investigation, then questioning foundational claims feels not just incorrect, but disloyal.
The statement he made there, trusting based off of revelation. So a lot of people don't realize this. It was news to me when I heard it, but the logic of it is just so obvious, right? And it's one of those things you can't apologize this away. As far as like the apologetics of things, you can't excuse this away. This is just common sense, right? The book of Genesis is a book that spans time frame. If you take the idea that the planet is 6,000 years old, right? Because that's kind of the classical Christian idea, is that, or at least in the Protestant sake, that the planet is only 6,000 years old, or 7,000 at this point. I don't know, 6,000 roughly. The planet's roughly 6,000 years old. You take it back 2,000 years to get to Jesus. Okay, so there's 4,000 years. Maybe you get another 1,000 years to get back to Moses. Okay, so now there's 3,000 years. Moses is the one who's credited with writing the book of Genesis. If Moses didn't write the book of Genesis, we don't know who wrote the book of Genesis, kind of thing, right? For the most part, it is accepted by basically everybody that Moses is the one who wrote the book of Genesis. Okay, so question. Adam and Eve is at year 1 because God created the entire place in a week, right? And Moses sits at year 3,000. Roughly, right? Whether it's 2,800 or whatever. But the point is, Moses is writing about events that happened thousands of years prior to his existence. On top of that, it's not only that he's writing about events that happened 2,000 years of his existence, but he's writing these word for word conversations that happened between God and random human beings, and between random human beings to other random human beings. These word for word conversations that happened thousands of years before the existence of Moses. Okay? Big problem. The logic of that, right? That just doesn't make sense. The idea that that the planet was created in 7 days. How does Moses know that? He was very obviously not there. The Christians argue divine inspiration. God told Moses that the earth was created in 7 days. God told Moses that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God told Moses all of these things. But at the end of the day, we're still working off of this idea that God spoke directly to a man, and a man started writing down on paper, right? So here is my rebuttal to that typical argument, is that if we are going to accept that there is one book in the Bible that is supposed basically the entirety of the book. I mean, think about the stories that were covered in the book of Genesis, right? So you've got the Tower of Babylon, you've got obviously creation, you've got Cain and Abel, you got the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the garden, you have Eden in general, you have Lot and Abraham, all that kind of stuff. You've got what else? What else? Sodom. I already said Sodom and Gomorrah. But you have all of these stories that exist in the book of Genesis, right? But Moses is writing about them, the same Moses that was delivering the Israelites out of the hand of Egypt, okay? The Noah's Ark, the flood, putting animals inside of the boat 2 by 2, right? The absolute impossibility of getting every single animal species, and and just two of them. Like, man, they must have been a prime breeding pair, Um, but but yeah, all of these stories, and the pissed off God, the God that's angry, the God that screams at people, the God that kills people on a whim, the God that says that he is a perfect God and he never regrets anything, even though in the Bible he's wiping out an entire planet because he's realized he's made a mistake, right? And it's just like, and so how is God perfect then? How is God, And so there's just these intense fallacies that come up from the book of Genesis, and the reason why he's saying divine revelation is because the person who wrote the book of Genesis was writing about events that happened thousands of years prior to his existence, right? There's just no way, logically speaking, that you could get word for word perfection from something that was written thousands of years ago for conversations that you didn't witness, right? So anyways, I just wanted to make that little point, because if somebody didn't understand why he said, taking facts in science over revelation, the reason why he said that is because Genesis is typically accepted to be divine revelation from God, right?
This is how communities become resistant to correction, reform, and growth. The danger isn't that Genesis gets the science wrong. Every ancient culture did. The danger is that it teaches people not to care when it's wrong, as long as the authority behind it remains intact.
Yeah.
Let's take Adam and Eve, for example. The Adam and Eve story in Genesis is often treated as a simple moral parable, but structurally it functions as a psychological blueprint, one that collapses under scrutiny. There is no evidence for a first human couple, no support from population genetics for humanity descending from two individuals, and no plausible framework in which a talking serpent and a magical tree dispensing moral knowledge makes any sense. These elements are not symbolic add-ons, they're the mechanism of the story. Remove them, and the narrative no longer explains why humans are broken, guilty, or in need of divine intervention. The story depends on supernatural shortcuts to establish a problem that does not otherwise exist. The deeper issue is not biological impossibility, it's psychological conditioning. Adam and Eve are punished not for harm, but for curiosity. They are explicitly denied moral knowledge, warned against gaining it, and then blamed for acting without it. This instills a moral logic where ignorance is expected, curiosity is framed as rebellion, and obedience is elevated above understanding. From the very beginning, the story teaches that moral agency is dangerous unless authorized. Knowledge is not portrayed as growth, but as trespass. Psychologically, this creates a shame-based identity structure. Humans are introduced to themselves not as developing beings, but as fallen ones, guilty.
And we see this in history throughout different populations that really focused on Christianity. Whenever I went to Spain, in the southern part of Spain, what you'll notice is that a lot of the buildings will start to exhibit. I don't know the exact word for it, but I want to say it's like Arabic architecture or something like that, or I forget. There's a specific name for it, but what you essentially see is that from Spain, the southern part of Spain, you start to see all of these kind of Islamic kind of architecture that starts to, go throughout the entirety of the countryside. And what they, from, at least from what I understood from the person who is kind of like explaining all of this to me, um, basically the reason why is because the Christians were discouraged from reading books outside of the Bible, discouraged from trying to do science because that was considered witchcraft, discouraged from trying to understand mathematics, discouraged from trying to pursue knowledge, discouraged from any sort of trying of self growth, of personal spirituality, of anything. They were completely discouraged of everything. And so what that led to was a population that was just, quite frank, so dumb but Bible thumping, right? That when the Muslims encountered them in southern Spain, and they started to trade with them across Marrakesh and Gibraltar, what they found out was that, hey, why don't we just take these people's land, because they don't have any fancy armory, they don't have any superior technology, they don't even understand basic mathematics. And so that's what happened. The Muslims came across the strait and just took Spain. Now I'm not getting these numbers 100% accurate, but according to the historian there, she said that the Muslims took almost the entire peninsula of Spain in 80 years, and that it took the Christians almost 800 years to take it back. Think about that. And whenever the Christians were taking back their land and stuff like that, they were book burning all of the science. They were book burning all of the mathematics. They were book burning all of the knowledge, because the only book you need is the Bible. You don't need anything else. You need the Bible. You need the church, right? And so it's so funny. It's so funny to kind of see that throughout history too. So
Before action, flawed before choice. This framing encourages individuals to distrust their own instincts, perceptions, and ethical intuitions. If the first act of independent reasoning is framed as catastrophic failure, then self trust becomes suspect by default. Over time, this produces a mindset where people look outward to authority, doctrine, or divine command for moral validation rather than cultivating internal ethical reasoning. Sociologically, the Adam and Eve narrative normalizes moral outsourcing. Right and wrong are no longer grounded in empathy, consequence, or shared human experience.
in the Adam and Eve narrative, also, that whole narrative goes to create the narrative that men are superior to women, that men were created first. Um, and in and of itself, the narrative doesn't make sense, because after Cain kills Abel, and Cain is sent out by his family to go, you can't live here, you got to go elsewhere. He says, I don't want to go elsewhere because the people of Nod, the people living in the land of Nod, are going to kill me. Well, there was only supposed to be an Adam and an Eve. How is there all of a sudden an entire city of people living in a land of Nod? Like, these logical fallacies are the things that crumble, and that, earlier, like what he was saying, you have to ignore all that kind of stuff and just say, no, 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 this is divine revelation. We don't need to understand all of it. And I think that's one of the worst phrases in Christianity, is when something doesn't make sense, the response is, it doesn't need to make sense. It's God. God's ways are higher than ours. And it's like, no, shit needs to make sense. You know?
but in compliance with external authority. This makes communities easier to govern through guilt and fear because moral certainty is always deferred upward. Leaders, institutions, and texts inherit disproportionate power, not because they demonstrate wisdom, but because they claim access to the original moral source humans were told they lost. The story doesn't just explain why people need guidance, it ensures they believe they cannot trust themselves without it. In this way, Adam and Eve is less an origin story.
The heart is desperately wicked. What is it? That verse. Everybody knows that verse that I'm trying to reference. But basically, one of the things that Christianity does to disengage your ability to tell the truth and to find direction is that they also tell you that you can't follow your heart. You can't follow your mind because your mind is wicked. You can't follow your heart because it's deceitful and desperately wicked. And so it leaves you in this state of not knowing what to trust. So then the church can come in and very clearly say, we are the authority. God is the authority. You need to trust us. You can't trust your mind and your thoughts because the fuck? Don't know what that was all about. You can't trust your mind and your leave a like. Sorry. You can't trust your mind because, you know, Satan, all that kind of shit. And then you can't trust your heart because it's deceitful and desperately wicked. And so you get this situation where people just don't know what to trust at all. And so then they can conveniently say, you need to trust us, right?
Than a psychological enclosure. It defines the human condition as inherently suspect, curiosity as dangerous, and autonomy as the root of catastrophe. And once that framework is accepted, control no longer needs to be enforced, it is internalized. Now let's talk about the fall, the crime that makes no sense. The so called fall in Genesis collapses under even basic moral reasoning. Adam and Eve are punished before they possess moral knowledge, held responsible for a choice they could not fully understand, and subjected to consequences that vastly outweigh the act itself. The narrative insists that moral awareness comes after disobedience, yet treats the disobedience as morally culpable.
It's funny, you know, the first thing that I always think of is a thought that I had. You know, we always look at North Korea. I don't know if you've ever heard of North Korea's generational punishment, but essentially I want to say it's 3 generations or something like that. But if you do something so bad in North Korea, they will put you in jail. Then they'll allow you to procreate, but then they'll put your kids in jail and they'll allow them to procreate, but then they'll put their kids in jail. And it's essentially 3 generations of punishment for the person who committed the initial crime, which the entire world looks at is disgusting, horrible, a massive human rights violation, just gross. But here we are in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve, you know, these 2 initial human beings did this horrible thing, and our entire species, you know, for as long as we live, are cursed, right? We're that immediately makes us born in sin, and that immediately makes us cursed to where now we have to work the ground. We have to, you know, the women have to basically be torn apart, and bearing children has to be painful. Men have to work and, you know, sweat of their brow, all that kind of crap. And it's just such a crazy thing because, you know, when we see a leader in North Korea doing a generational curse, we think that leader is just absolutely horrible and wicked. Yet the God that so many people worship is this person who has cursed not one, not two, not three, not 4 generations, but thousands, hundreds of thousands of generations have been cursed. And then he sits there and as a like, you guys did this to yourself. You know, it's just this weird dynamic.
This reverses the most fundamental principle of justice. Accountability requires understanding. In no ethical system outside of theology do we punish ignorance with total condemnation, especially when that ignorance was intentionally imposed. The logical incoherence deepens when the source of the ignorance is examined. God explicitly withholds knowledge, warns against acquiring it, and then responds with punishment when it's gained. This is not a test of character. It's a
So
closed
did the
system
church.
designed to fail. The outcome is guaranteed, not because humans are flawed, but because the conditions make failure inevitable.
I mean, and it's not only God, right? You can go to any church on Sunday morning and say, Pastor, you've got a whole bunch of things here that don't make sense. Can we try to like make it make sense? You will be discouraged from it. You're immediately going to, don't go there, don't go that direction, don't talk about that, just stick to the faith. My sister, who's a missionary, well, she's not technically a missionary. She used to be a missionary, but now she just lives with a youth pastor, or lives with married to a youth path. And what she told me, she went to Bible college. I didn't go to Bible college. I went to secular school, which means that I was burning in hell, right? Because going to a college outside of a Bible college is sinful. Um, my sister told me that she doesn't want her kids to go to Bible college because so many people walk out of the faith when they start studying the Bible. Think about that. Isn't that crazy, right? I mean, the idea that you're going to go to college to grow deeper in your studies, and what you actually end up finding out is that, nothing makes sense. The religion doesn't make sense. The whole thing is stupid, You get to see all of the problems with it and all sorts of stuff. So, yeah, it's kind of crazy to see.
Psychologically, this establishes a worldview where authority defines both the rules and the trap and then blames the subject for falling into it. From an ethical standpoint, the relationship modeled here would be considered abusive in any human context. Withholding critical information, setting invisible boundaries, enforcing disproportionate punishment, and framing curiosity as betrayal are hallmark features of coercive control. If a parent locked knowledge away from a child, punished them for seeking understanding, and then imposed lifelong consequences for a single act of disobedience, we wouldn't call it discipline, we'd call child protective services. The only reason this dynamic escapes scrutiny is because the authority involved is labeled
For real.
divine. Sociologically, the fall functions as a normalization
So I talking
engine
about North
for
Korea.
unjust power structures. It teaches that those in authority may impose rules
I love
without
this
explanation, punish without proportionality, and demand trust without accountability. Once this framework is accepted at the cosmic level, it becomes transferable to earthly hierarchies, religious leaders, institutions, governments, and even families. The story doesn't just explain suffering, it justifies it. Pain becomes deserved, questioning becomes dangerous, and submission becomes virtuous. The fall, then, is not a story about human failure. It's a story about moral confusion institutionalized as doctrine. It trains people to accept punishment without clarity, authority without transparency, and guilt without cause. And once that logic is internalized, injustice no longer needs to be argued for. It feels inevitable. The gender framework introduced in Genesis is not incidental, it's structural. Woman is created second, derived from the man rather than alongside him, and positioned as dependent rather than co equal. She's blamed first for disobedience, even though the narrative itself shows shared participation. And her punishment is uniquely embodied pain in childbirth, and subordination in relationship. The text does not describe these outcomes as tragic consequences to be resisted or overcome, but as divinely imposed conditions of existence. Male rule is not presented as a cultural failure, it's mandated. Psychologically, this framing installs a symmetry at the level of identity. Women are introduced into the human story not as autonomous moral agents, but as derivative, vulnerable, and morally suspect. Suffering becomes gendered from the outset. Women's pain is framed as punishment, while man's dominance is framed as order. This shapes internalized expectations long before any social institution reinforces them. When inequality is presented as cosmic design, resisting it feels not just rebellious, but unnatural. Sociologically, Genesis provides the theological scaffolding for patriarchy. Submission theology, sexual shame, and the normalization of gendered suffering all trace back to this origin story. Women's bodies become sites of moral consequence, while male authority is insulated from scrutiny by divine endorsement. This dynamic legitimizes power imbalances across family structures, religious institutions, and legal systems. The narrative doesn't merely reflect ancient sexism, it sanctifies it. The long term consequences of moral double standard embedded into culture. Women are taught to associate their bodies with danger, temptation, and consequence, while men are taught to associate leadership with entitlement and control. Desire becomes suspect, autonomy becomes risky, and suffering becomes spiritually meaningful, especially for women. These patterns persist even in.
Oh my God, man, he is just absolutely nailing everything. Wow, he's getting it. He's getting it, you know. Um, my dad. Well, first of all, it's maybe not for every church, because I know that a lot of like the bigger kind of, mega churches and things like that, you'll still find a ton of people who are in the congregation, who go out drinking on Friday nights, who go out partying, they go out and have a bikini beach party and all sorts of things. And that's the lofty side of Christianity, that the majority of the more in-depth Christians, like I grew up independent fundamental Baptist, right? My pastor always made sure that we touted that we are independent fundamental Baptist. In other words, we were the bat shittiest of the batshit crazy. And so um, and so basically, you know, women were not allowed to put on makeup, because putting on makeup was seen as vanity. And if you were putting on makeup, if you were trying to make yourself look beautiful for church, then it was seen as something that you were focused on the wrong thing in life. You shouldn't be focused on, trying to make yourself look pretty, because then your heart is wrong and in the wrong place. You should be focused on God, not on, on what you look like. And they create this thing where it's like your every living and breathing second is God focused, and then on top of that, that God focus is God control, right? You can't wear any, shirts that show, like, this was too much. If you had a shirt that showed that much skin, straight to hell. You had to have skirts that went well below the knee. You had to just all sorts of stuff, zero cleavage. You couldn't wear clothes that were fitting to your body. You had to wear these kind of looser dresses, because it was seen that the way that the woman dressed, if it tempted the man, it was the woman's fault for tempting the man, right? And then on the man side of thing, it's control. It's controlling your wife. It's controlling your girlfriend, or it's controlling your kids. It is control. And that's how and your authority that is given to you by God as the leader of the household. You only take your authority from God, because the hierarchy is God, man, woman, children, right? And so because of that, children can't say anything to man. Women can't say anything to man. The only thing that can say anything to man is God, right? And but if you're a woman, your children can't say anything to you, but your man can say something to you. And if you're kids, you just get, both shits, all three of them just fucking you over. Just kidding. But still, it's like, I remember my dad. There were so many situations where my dad, the Bible creates this situation where this violent wrath is justified as long as you're aligned with God, right? And so I can't tell you how many situations I've had in my childhood growing up where I would either ask dad a question, or I would bring out these kind of issues with the Bible, or I would say that I didn't, and he would just explode in a fury of just wrath and anger, and a monster came out of this guy, right? And it was my fault, right? It was my fault that that came out of him because, I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be doing that, right? The kind of narcissistic thing. And then on top of that, it was, God has given me this divine authority and you have to listen to me, and all this kind of stuff. And so it just sets up this dynamic where, because God in the Old Testament is so mean and so violent and so vile and so can't contain his emotions and often runs out and kills everybody out of anger, it creates this situation where it's justified to act poorly, to be crazy, to just let out the intense anger, as long as it's divinely guided, as long as it's justified because you're protecting the faith or something like that. And so that's why when you see in the Bible, you see Jesus went into the temple and everybody was using the temple as like basically a big shopping center. And Jesus goes in there with the whips and everything, and he starts overthrowing the tables and whipping everybody and shooing everybody out and rebuking everybody and screaming at everybody to get out of the temple and all that kind of stuff. That's not seen as a bad thing. That's seen as a good thing because it's divine wrath, right? It's God. It's God being pissed off and just an absolute animal, but it's morally justified. And so, what does that do? It gives a lot of men in the church the excuse to be this absolute pissed off person as long as it's morally justified, right? So, yeah, I mean, he's nailing it.
Modern context where the theology is softened, but the assumptions still remain intact. Genesis then is not neutral groundwork later misused by patriarchal societies. It is the source code. By framing inequality as divine design rather than social construction, it transforms injustice into obedience and oppression into virtue. And once hierarchy is written into the origin of humanity itself, dismantling it requires challenging not just culture, but God. Now, from its earliest scriptures, Genesis introduces a God whose primary response to human failure is not correction, restoration, or growth, but violence. Humans are cursed almost immediately after disobedience, not guided toward understanding or repair. This pattern escalates rapidly. God kills nearly all life in the flood, chooses favorites among humans, and punishes entire populations for the actions of individuals. These are not isolated incidents, they form a consistent behavioral profile. Divine authority is established not through wisdom or patience, but through overwhelming force. Psychologically, this conditions readers to associate power with punishment rather than care. When the highest moral authority resolves conflict through destruction, violence becomes framed as a legitimate, even righteous solution to disorder. The absence of proportional responses teach that might defines right, and that control is more important than comprehension. Instead of modeling moral development, the narrative models domination. This has lasting effects on how people understand leadership, discipline, and justice. Sociologically, the God of Genesis functions as a template for authoritarian systems, collective punishment, favoritism, and the erasure of entire groups are portrayed as morally acceptable when enacted by sufficiently powerful authority. This legitimizes top down control structures in which leaders are exempt from accountability because their power is assumed to justify their actions. When violence is sanctified at the cosmic level, it becomes easier to excuse it at the institutional level, whether in religion, politics, or even family systems. The pattern is especially telling. God does not correct behavior, God resets the board. Rather than teaching humans how to live together, the narrative repeatedly wipes out failure and starts over. This discourages moral learning and reinforces the idea that some lives are expendable in service of order. Empathy becomes secondary to obedience, and survival becomes contingent on alignment with power rather than ethical growth. By introducing divine violence as normal, Genesis reshapes moral intuition itself. Harm is no longer something.
And we see that all over government systems. We see that all over the way society acts in general. It's just this like absolute outrage of you are the one who's the problem and thus you need to shut up. It is quite crazy to see how quickly stuff gets shot down just because of the fact that, maybe you disagree with something immediately, just immediately shot down. And because of that entire section of the Bible, it encourages people to act in that way, which further fucks up family systems, which further causes intense trauma, which further causes people to feel suicidal and to want to kill themselves, which further causes people to feel like they were born into a family, that they were born into a world system that doesn't support them, that makes them feel like they're the problem, right? Especially if you have something like a homosexual person who was born homosexual and or not born homosexual, but born with the attraction to the same sex. And in Christianity, they immediately shame that person, and they get put into this position where they feel like they need to stay quiet because coming out is so dangerous, right? Coming out means being ostracized from the family. Coming out means devastating the family's public image. The coming out means, being the black sheep, means never being able to reconnect with your family. It means having yourself called out potentially publicly in the church, and having your private your private your private sexuality, you know touted for an entire church congregation to decide what to do with you. And it's just like, it is such a risk. It is such a risk for people to come out in those belief systems. And that's why, and look, I'm not gonna say, I'm not gonna pray to be the, or pray, or oh, words. I'm not going to act like I'm the perfect person here. Whenever I was in the depths of Christianity, I was right there with them. I was like, no, if you're gay, you're going to hell. It is a choice. It is not something, it's just all these sorts of things that they convince you as a child, that these are your problems. You were not born this way. That's one of the worst things with Christianity, is the intense gaslighting. The gaslighting is crazy. You say something and somebody else is just like, no, that's not true. And you say, I had this experience. No, you didn't have that experience. I was born this way. No, you weren't born that way. And they just convince you that you're the problem consistently. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're the problem. You're not the problem. You're not the problem. Look at nature. There are all sorts of species. There are hundreds of species that demonstrate homosexual behavior. There are hundreds of species that demonstrate, these different relationship dynamics that would be considered evil in the church's eyes, because monogamy is the only thing that's divine, and everything else is just disgusting. And you have these in the animal kingdom. You have every flavor of relationship that exists out in the animal kingdom. And in Christianity tries to separate the human being from being an animal on this planet. Now, obviously, we're very intelligent, and it is something that separates us from the other animals on this planet. But at the same time, there are levels of intelligences that we just don't understand, that are still natural to this planet, right? So, yeah, it's just, I always feel bad. I always feel bad for people like that, especially who are having to grow up in these systems, because it's just like, you have this person who's expressing themselves, who just wants to be a certain way, and Christianity's like, no, divine wrath coming shortly because you decided to be born gay, and you decided to not change your mind about how you feel about the opposite sex. So I am going to ostracize you. I am going to remove all of my help from you. I'm going to completely, like, oh my God, it is a lot.
To be minimized or questioned. It's something to be justified when committed by the right authority. And once violence is framed as sacred, resisting it feels like rebellion, not conscience. The danger is not just that Genesis depicts a violent God, it teaches people to see violence as virtue when it wears the mask of righteousness. The flood narrative in Genesis represents the clearest.
And that's the thing too. It's like everybody acts like God in the Bible, okay? because my belief now is God exists. The Bible was just humans' attempt to, either control the narrative or to control the population, or a disgusting misunderstanding and an explanation of why shit happens, right? That's how I view the Bible now. But uh, you know, you get into these situations where um, okay, I forgot where I was going with that. Let's see. Flood narrative, Genesis, clear declaration between this. Okay, I've had a brain fart. We'll go ahead and keep moving forward. If it comes back to me, I'll chat about it.
Collision between mythic storytelling and moral catastrophe. Scientifically, the story collapses on every front. There is no global geological flood layer, no evidence of a worldwide deluge within the proposed time frame, no feasible way to house, feed, and preserve millions of species on a single wooden vessel, and no plausible genetic pathway for life to rebound from such an extreme bottleneck without immediate extinction level consequences. These are not minor gaps, they are foundational impossibilities. The story cannot be reconciled with biology, geology, or ecology without abandoning the very sciences that explain the world we actually inhabit. But the deeper problem is not scientific, it's moral. The flood depicts the mass killing of nearly all humans, including children, infants, and those incapable of moral agency, along with the near total destruction of animal life. This is not justice, it's collective punishment on a planetary scale. The narrative offers no meaningful distinction between guilt and innocence, no proportionality, and no attempt at rehabilitation. Entire populations are erased not for what they did, but for what they were associated with. Violence becomes indiscriminate and suffering becomes collateral. Psychologically, this story normalizes catastrophic solutions to complex problems. When the highest authority responds to moral failure by extermination rather than education or reform, it teaches that destruction is an acceptable, admirable form of problem solving. This conditions readers to see extreme measures as justified when patience fails, and to accept that some lives are simply expendable in the service of order. Empathy is overridden by allegiance to authority, and moral discomfort is reframed as faithfulness. Sociologically, the flood functions as a mythic endorsement of authoritarian control. Tyrants do not persuade, correct, or coexist. They purge. The logic of the flood mirrors the logic of totalitarian regimes. Identify corruption, eliminate it wholesale, preserve a remnant, and declare the outcome righteous. The rainbow that follows does not undo the violence, it aestheticizes it. Mass death is softened with symbolism, transforming genocide into divine reset rather than a moral failure. The narrative's internal tension only deepens the problem. God is said to regret the decision to create humanity, a claim that undermines divine omniscience while simultaneously excusing mass violence as an emotional reaction. This
Well, I
portrays
always
a
bring
deity
that
who
up.
solves problems impulsively, then promises not.
It always causes an issue because the idea is that God is perfect. He doesn't make mistakes, and it's like, okay, then why is God regretting things? Why is God creating a planet and then destroying everything and everyone? Let me see something really quick. Genesis 6, 6 and 7. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply grieved. So the Lord said, I will wipe them out from the face of the earth, the human race I have created. Very clearly states in the book of Genesis that God regretted what he had made, which is why he sent the flood, right? So think about that. This perfect God who never makes mistakes, who's omniscient, who's omnipresent, who's unconditionally loving, who is this fairy tale kind of God, who absolutely hated his decision and said, I absolutely screwed this up. I'm going to just kill everything and everyone, and then we'll just start over, right? And instead of completely starting over, he said, you know what? There are a couple of people that I like, and there's a couple of animals that I'll like. I'll put them on a little boat. Fuck it. So it is pretty interesting.
To do it again, not because it was wrong, but because it was excessive. He went a little too far that time. In any human context, this would be deeply alarming behavior. The flood, then, is not a story about cleansing evil. It's a story about power without restraint. It teaches that when authority is absolute, accountability disappears and violence can be reframed as virtue. Genesis does not merely recount a catastrophe, it models a moral universe where annihilation is an acceptable substitute for understanding. And once that lesson is absorbed, tyranny no longer looks immoral, it looks divine. The Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis presents one of the most revealing moments in the text, not because of what humans do wrong, but because of what they actually do right. Humanity is depicted as unified, cooperative, technologically capable, and linguistically aligned. There's no violence, no moral corruption, no injustice described. The problem, according to the story, is effectiveness. Humans working together are portrayed as a threat not because they're harming one another, but because they're capable of accomplishing great things without divine mediation. The divine response is not guidance or partnership, but sabotage. God confuses language specifically to disrupt communication, collaboration, and progress. This is not a correction of wrongdoing, it is an intentional fracturing of human solidarity. Psychologically, the story frames unity as dangerous and fragmentation as protective. Cooperation becomes suspect, and shared understanding becomes something that must be limited to preserve authority. The subtext is unmistakable. Unity without divine control is a threat. Knowledge is equated with rebellion, and progress is reframed as hubris. Rather than celebrating human ingenuity or collective problem solving, the narrative casts them as existential risks. This teaches readers to associate advancement with arrogance and to view large scale cooperation as something that requires suppression. Curiosity and ambition are not nurtured, they're policed. Sociologically, the Tower of Babel functioned as an origin myth for division. Linguistic, cultural, and social fragmentation are not treated as tragic outcomes of human conflict, but as divinely imposed safeguards against human empowerment. This reframes disunity as intentional and even beneficial, discouraging efforts toward global solidarity. When division is sanctified, reconciliation becomes optional and cooperation becomes conditional. In broader cultural terms, this story undermines human centered progress. It suggests that collective advancement is inherently dangerous unless tightly controlled by higher authority. This is the logic of anti human advancement mythology, the belief that humans must be restrained, not trusted, limited, not empowered. Once this framework is internalized,
Seek not in your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. Right? That whole idea that you should never, be trying to figure things out on your own. You should be never trying to go onto your own path of seeking knowledge. All you need to do is seek God, and God will tell you what to do, kind of thing. It is pretty crazy.
innovation feels risky, collaboration feels suspect, and progress itself becomes morally ambiguous. The Tower of Babel does not warn against tyranny, it models it. It portrays a world where power is preserved by keeping people divided, confused, and unable to organize effectively. And that lesson has echoed far beyond the story itself, shaping how authority responds to unity, how institutions fear cooperation, and how progress is often treated as something to be managed rather than embraced. The concept of a chosen people introduced in Genesis marks a decisive shift in the moral architecture of the text. God begins selecting favorites, individuals and lineages who receive protection, blessing, and promise, not because of
Let's see how much there is to go. I'm getting pretty tired.
demonstrated ethical superiority, but because of divine preference. Blessings are inherited rather than earned, passed down through bloodlines rather than behavior. This introduces a moral asymmetry at the heart of the narrative. Some people are closer to goodness by birth, while others exist outside the circle of favor, regardless of conduct. Psychologically, this framing reshapes moral identity around status instead of action. Worth becomes something conferred, not cultivated. Those inside the chosen group are encouraged to see themselves as special, protected, and justified, even when their actions mirror or exceed the harm of those outside it. This creates a powerful cognitive buffer against self critique. When identity itself is sanctified, accountability feels optional, and moral reflection becomes secondary to group loyalty. Sociologically, chosen people theology lays the groundwork for ethnic exceptionalism and divine favoritism. Violence, exploitation, and displacement can be reframed as obedience when enacted by the chosen, while the same actions are condemned when committed by others. This produces moral double standards that are not accidental but structural. The narrative does not merely tolerate injustice, it rationalizes it through election. Power is no longer evaluated by its effects, but by who wields it. This logic has enduring consequences. When chosenness is treated as inherited status, it becomes easily transferable to nationalism, racial hierarchy, and ideological supremacy. The belief that we are different quietly becomes we are entitled. Outsiders then are no longer neighbors with competing interests, they are obstacles to destiny. Once moral worth is tied to election rather than empathy, exclusion feels righteous and domination feels deserved. Genesis then
Guys, give me a second.
does not simply describe.
Oh, what's going on? Oh, is there a way to turn my microphone off? I gotta address some people in the room. Oh, there's no way to turn the microphone off. What about through here? Okay, whatever. I'll just try to deal with it.
Describe a people set apart for responsibility. It introduces a framework where favoritism is holy and inequality is justified by design. By embedding chosenness into the origin story, the text transforms privilege into providence and power into the proof of moral standing. And once that equation is accepted, injustice no longer needs to hide, it can claim divine backing. One of the deepest ironies surrounding Genesis is that the way it is most aggressively defended today is historically indefensible. Genesis is not a single unified work authored by one mind with one theology. It's a composite text formed from multiple oral traditions, written sources, and editorial layers stitched together over time by communities with differing concerns and worldviews. This is why the book opens with two creation accounts that conflict in order, emphasis, and even theology. These are not complementary perspectives.
And that's the biggest thing with the Genesis thing is that you know it's 3,000 years, right? If I were to task one man with writing about information from 3,000 years ago, you know, what it comes down to is that, and what's generally accepted is that it is oral traditions, random manuscripts, random things that people know. Like it is all of this stuff kind of compiled together to form the Book of Genesis, and that's why it's just like, you know, if it's an oral tradition, then another culture's oral tradition is just as valid. You know, another culture's creation story is just as valid because, you know, in this video he makes the statement that Genesis is kind of the foundation that Christianity is built upon. And I would say the two foundations that Christianity is built upon is Genesis and Paul, because Genesis is what lays the groundwork for all of the things that he had mentioned in the video, right? Paul lays the fear mechanism, the mechanism of control, right? Because think about it. If you're, and I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. It is.
They are competing.
We still have another what? Looks like we have another 10-15 minutes left to go in the video. Well, let me see if I can just kind of see what the topics are. Literalism in modern structural necessity, and conclusion finding clarity. Let's see if we can just kind of read his thumbnails. Okay, here we go. Tower of Babel, unity is a threat. Chosen people, divine favoritism, literalism and modern misinterpretations. That's where we're at right now. The structural necessity of Genesis. Yeah, let's go here. Conclusion, finding clarity and purpose. Let's go to structural necessity of Jesus.
Christianity's fierce defense of Genesis is not primarily about historical truth. It's about structural necessity. If Genesis collapses, the doctrine of original sin collapses with it. Without a literal or semi-literal fall, there is no inherited guilt passed down through humanity, no universal moral defect requiring supernatural repair. And without original sin...
And the worst part about it is that, you know, I think, I don't know if he's atheist agnostic. I know for sure he's atheist, but, you know, I still believe in God. And that's not going to ever change for me simply because of the experiences that I've had in life. I've had a lot. I've had so many experiences in my life that cannot be explained by science. And you know, I've also not been alone in experiencing those things. You know, I've had well, it is quite the story. But basically, this is why I have such a hard and because the thing is, whenever I was initially deconstructing, for a moment, especially whenever I was in college, I was going down the atheistic route. Because yeah, you start to study stuff, and then you start to look at the Bible, and then you start to study kind of the facts, the scientific facts that we have, and you start to realize, okay, stuff is not vibing, right? Because you know you can't have these, you can't have oh, I can't think it, and nothing is coming to mind right now because I'm so tired and I want to go to bed. But because I think this is my like second or third video today. I love this kind of stuff. I live and die for this kind of stuff. And so for me, sitting down and making 3 videos a day does not bother me at all because this is how much I enjoy doing this specific stuff. Which is why whenever I had started my channel a long time ago, it was kind of like a contrasting thing because as much as I wanted to just talk about things, I also love to kind of dive into the atheistic side of things because for a while I kind of walked down that road. But you know, there are experiences, there are things that cannot be explained by science, right? There are these connections that cannot be explained by science. If you don't believe it, you should look up a book called A Secret Life of Plants. Okay, it's written as I want to say it's published as a fiction book, but all of the papers that they reference in that book I were published, I want to say in the 60s or something like that, 60s or 70s. It happened whenever I was in undergrad and I was researching plants. And the reason why I was researching plants is because I was on the mammalian side of things, the mammalian physiology side of things, but I didn't actually want to start cutting open animals and things like that. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll cut open plants. And I started to see all of these things that just didn't make any sense, you know, as far as like electrical activity with plants, the idea that whenever I would either walk into a room or shout or anything like that, electrical stimuli inside of a plant would spike. You know, if I would smack the plant with a little pencil, the electrical stimuli would spike. But if I cut the plant with a pair of scissors, the electrical stimuli would, you know, almost quadruple and would elongate. So rather than having this big, massive electrical spike that lasted a quarter of a second, you would have these massive electrical spikes that would last almost 6 to 7 seconds, or the duration of you cutting the plant. And what you could also see was electrical exhaustion in the plant from continuously being smacked, beaten, cut to shreds, right? Um, and you can also see that plants communicate with each other and that they hold memory and things like that. Plants are extremely understudied. And, you know, plants, they've been able to verify that plants, if you have 2 plants inside of a room and you beat the hell out of one of the plants and you walk out of the room, the plant in the following room will react with intense fear. Okay, well, we don't know fear, okay, but will react with intense electrical stimuli or output, whatever, intense electrical output at seeing the other person who just ended that plant in the room with that specific plant, right? And so it just blows your brain open with the idea that the physical world is the only thing that we understand. And then you also see that, there are species of coral that are around the entire planet, and they all spawn at the exact same moment, even if they are in a separate tank, separated from the rest of their family in the ocean. They will still spawn at the exact same moment, right? And so you get these things where it's like you cannot explain these things in science. And personally, I've experienced so many things that you just can't explain with science. And that's why I always maintain the fact that, or what I would consider the fact that there is a supernatural world. There is a world that exists that we can't see. It is and so that's why for me it is easy to fathom the existence of God. And so I never go into this whole thing of, God doesn't exist. I certainly go into Christianity has attempted to describe the thing, right? Because that's even what it comes down to. Is Christianity prescribes it as kind of this masculine thing, whatever it is. But the reality is that it has no gender, it has no form, it has no body, right? Everybody says that, we were formed in the image of God. That's why we look like this. Okay, well, the image of God could also be an idea of divine spark, right? And we have a divine spark that other beings on the planet may not have, or whatever. Or maybe the image of God is an atom. And so being, created in the image of God is being this big mass conglomeration of atoms, right? And so I think that it's so complicated that you may never be able to find out what it is. Um, and yeah, with the Genesis thing, the reason why I say Genesis and Paul is because Paul is the one who derives the fear mechanism, right? God is the one who sets, or not God. Genesis is the one who sets the foundation for God. Genesis is the one who sets the foundation for you need to follow God no matter what. God has his chosen people. God has his people he's going to kill. God is, this kind of really violent man at times. And that's why you get a lot of people who are kind of scared of the idea of pissing off God, right? But it is sealed into your DNA with fear by Paul, right? Because if there wasn't Paul, Paul is the one who kind of created the idea of the threat of eternal damnation and all that kind of stuff. And Paul's the one that came up with the idea that the reason why Jesus died on the cross was for our sins. There's a part, I forget what book it's in, maybe Corinthians or something like that, where Paul is confronting Matthew, one of the actual apostles of Jesus. Paul never met Jesus. I don't know if you guys knew that. If you did, that's kind of common knowledge. If you didn't know, sorry to burst your bubble. But Paul never met Jesus. So how can he be an apostle of Jesus, right? Well, because, Jesus appeared to him on his road to on the road to go kill a bunch of Christians, and the donkey started talking too. The donkey started talking. A light appeared in front of him and said, what is it, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me, or something like that. And there was no witnesses. There was nobody to verify the account, and we just have to believe the guy, And so he's the one that created the idea that when we die on the cross, that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. In the Bible, you can look in the second chapter of Revelation. This is when Jesus comes to John in a dream. And in the dream, he says all these things. Now, keep in mind, Revelation is a dream, okay? So many Christians try to take it literally. It is a dream, first of all. Second of all, when you look at the chapter 2 of the book of Revelation, you can see where what is it? You can see where Jesus congratulates Paul. No. Jesus congratulates the church at Ephesus for rejecting false prophets and for maintaining the faith, right? Or not 100% maintaining the faith, because then he says you've left your first love. But essentially, he's congratulating them for the most part, maintaining the faith, right? Here's the thing that's kind of funny. The Paul, the only nugget that we have to show that Paul might have been against Jesus, or Jesus might have been against Paul, is that Jesus congratulates the church of Ephesus for denying all false apostles and for trying them to be liars. In Acts, Paul, it says that all the churches in Asia, which includes the church at Ephesus, all the churches in Asia rejected Paul as a false prophet. And here in the book of Revelation, we have Jesus congratulating that church for rejecting. It's something interesting to think about. So, but yeah, he's making the strong point that, you know, Christianity, the foundation of Christianity is the book of Genesis, which 100% I would agree with that. The only thing I would add to that is probably the rebar in that foundation is all of Paul's teachings.
Sin, the central problem Christianity claims to solve, no longer exists. The narrative loses its starting wound. Once original sin fails, the need for Jesus as a cosmic solution also fails. Atonement theology depends on a catastrophic moral rupture at the beginning of human history, one that only divine sacrifice can undo. If humanity was never fallen in the way Genesis describes, then the logic of substitutionary death becomes incoherent. Salvation shifts from rescue to reinterpretation, and the cross becomes symbolic rather than necessary. Christianity is no longer the cure for a fatal condition, it becomes one philosophy among many addressing the human experience. Psychologically, this creates existential pressure to preserve Genesis at all costs. When a belief system is built like a load bearing structure, removing the foundation threatens collapse higher up. This produces defensive reasoning when evidence is filtered not by accuracy, but by threat level. Questions about Genesis are treated as spiritual danger signals, not intellectual inquiries. Doubt becomes.
Oh man, my pastor couldn't stand me. I was like, hold on, this doesn't make sense. He'd be like, John, you're going down a dark road. Stop it, you know. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end the video there, guys, because I am getting tired. But the only thing that I want to add to that is, you know, Jesus and Paul just do not align in teachings. It's as simple as that. The only parts where you have in the Bible where Jesus and Paul kind of align in teachings is in Luke. And one thing to keep in mind is that Luke, I'm pretty sure, was an apostle of Paul. Luke was also not one of the original apostles. Basically, we have Matthew, Mark, and John. Those are really the only three books. You know, maybe there's some others that I don't know off the top of my head because, like I said, I haven't prepared anything because this is just kind of a react video. But Jesus's teachings are pretty simple. They're pretty basic. He goes into them all the time. He says you'll know a tree by its fruit. A good tree bears good fruit. A bad tree bears bad fruit. And it is simple as that, right? Whereas Paul basically throws out the entire thing and says, no, it is strictly by faith alone. And, you know, Jesus has said many times that he washed his disciples' feet. Well, I'm going to make a separate video about that because I want to kind of come up with a small series of videos that I can kind of have in a line where, or in kind of in a, you know, I want to make walking away from Christianity safer than a lot of these channels because, you know, the atheistic deconstructing channels, you know, you have to realize that the Christian person in general, it's going to be very hard to convince that person that God doesn't exist, right? And so, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, in general, whether your belief system is that God exists or God doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. The matter is, who are you? how do you treat people? How are you nice to people? Are you loving to people? Are you kind to people? Are you a jerk? Do you judge people? Do you try to suppress people's natural rights? Do you suppress the ability for a person to, um, do you suppress the ability for a person to, kind of express their internal being, right? In the idea of a person who's homosexual, right? Or you a person who, you know, does is very neutral about things, and it's just, you support people on their journey through life, and that is just how it is, kind of thing. And so eventually, I do want to make kind of a series of videos where, coming from hard Christianity background that I grew up in, and walking away slowly, being safer in that whole experience, because I can't tell you how many times I was scared for my life, scared for my soul, scared that I had accidentally gone into something too demonic and I was going to end up in hell, scared for, and so many times throughout my journey, I required that God send a Christian person to kind of comfort me throughout my journey. And like I said, I mean, I've had so many signals from God, Christians randomly walking up to me and saying, I don't know why I need to tell you this, but I just feel like you are going the right path, and all this kind of stuff. That's happened multiple times. But also, probably one of the more scary, ghosty kind of situations, if you would, was one night. I was really concerned because I had been watching channeling videos, I had been watching near death experience videos, and just all sorts of things. And so I was walking away from Christianity. I was getting really scared. And so one night I just told God, I was like, look, at this point, I think I've gone way too far. And I think I think I've accidentally walked into Satan's trap, kind of thing. And so I told him, I was like, look, I need a sign immediately if possible. I need to feel safe because I don't feel safe walking down this path anymore. And that night, this is probably going to creep a lot of you out. And this is kind of the reason why I say it's like, you know, things don't make sense in my life, and that's fine. I don't try to assign meaning to it, right? Even though I'm about to assign meaning to it. But the little television that I had inside of my room turned on by itself. Not only did it turn on by itself, but it turned on YouTube at the moment of turning on, which also doesn't make any sense. On top of that, it not only turned on YouTube at the moment that it turned on, but it turned on a sermon of a black woman, of an older black woman preaching, which already went against my kind of, because in Second Timothy or First Timothy, it clearly states that women are not allowed to teach men. And so me growing up as a Christian always saw Joyce Myers as like a person who was damned to hell because she was teaching men, and that was not her place as a woman. She was not to be in a role, not to be in a position of leadership according to the Bible, right? And that's because I took the Bible literally. And this TV, 2 o'clock in the morning, just turns on by itself and starts playing a video of this old lady preaching. And she's preaching about trust in God's path, not giving up, not getting scared, trusting in the Spirit, allowing God to lead you and not to lead you, and not to freak out, don't get scared, you're safe, kind of thing. Like, um, and so it's like, describe that at 2 o'clock in the morning. The TV that I never use and that I never go on YouTube because I basically exclusively used Roku or Roku, whatever they call it. This TV turns on by itself, pulls up YouTube, and puts on a video about a specific sermon, which on my YouTube, there are no sermons on my YouTube, okay? I do not, 100%, I do not go and say, oh yeah, let's go check out this sermon. I'm not that guy. There's nowhere in my feed where you'll see a sermon. Well, maybe lately because I've been looking stuff up for these videos, but But this thing turns on by itself, and it's literally just a lady preaching about trusting God's path and to continue to walk down his path. And even though it may get scary at times, trust in his path, trust in the process, all this kind of stuff. And so that's why for me, things like that, you can label them as taboo, but they've happened and they've happened and they've happened and they've happened and they've happened so many times that it's just like, okay, you know, I accept that we don't understand anything. The scientific community can masquerade saying that they know the secrets to the universe, but the reason why they do that is because they can't study the taboo topics. You know, there's area in on the guy's channel, area 52. Love that guy's channel. There's a channel where this one guy, he in Britain does research on this one guy in Britain does research on a poltergeist haunted house, and they do all these things. They set up all these cameras, they set up all these sensors, they publish papers on the thing, and he is already seen as kind of an out there guy. And so for him, it's relatively safe because he's not going to end a career making a video off of that kind of stuff. And he just goes through the data that they find. He goes through the data of everything that's kind of existing in that specific space that they were studying, and you can see there is a lot of energetic things that are measurable that we can see happening. And so for the first time now we have somebody taking the scientific process and applying it to topics that are typically seen as taboo, right? And so yeah, that's the only reason why. That's the only reason why for me, it's walking into atheism. I understand not everybody has experiences, especially if you live in the depths of the city. You're not going to have that many experiences because you have so much stuff. There's so much chaos. There's so much noise. There's so many disturbances. You're going to have hardly any experiences. But you can ask anybody who lives kind of like way out in the wilderness. They see so many things. They interact with so many things. It is a normal thing. Whenever I lived in Alaska, and we would talk about these taboo topics, they weren't taboo in Alaska because it was common knowledge. You know, in the United States, it is these, you're crazy for the up in the Arctic. It's just like, oh, I saw a pigeon today. Oh, no way. Or I saw a bald eagle today. Like, oh, that's cool. I saw an owl today. Oh, really? That's really cool. Like that is the kind of conversation that you have with with this specific topic. So, okay, I'm gonna end it there. I'm getting tired, and I've got a lot of stuff to do tomorrow since we're kind of transitioning a bunch of stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys do enjoy the video, let me press this button here. If you guys do enjoy the video, let me know. As you can see, my process, is it efficient? It gets done. So, but if you guys enjoy the video, like, comment, subscribe. I would love to hear your thoughts on some of this stuff. If you want me to go into the taboo things, let me know. If you want me to go into kind of the crazier experiences that I've had, let me know. I'd love to share my story, but I don't want to share my story if nobody cares to hear. So yeah. In general, I mean, this video is awesome. I would send this video to my parents. I just, and oh my god, that in itself could be an entire video. But yeah, I absolutely love this video. He is spot on with so much of the damage that it creates, and I'd love to make kind of a separate video of the specific damage. So, okay, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, comment, subscribe, and any questions, leave them in the comments, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.